And I'll give you guys the hack right now for the people for anyone out there actually wanting to get better, especially someone that wants to be a better coach. Here's the hack, because people get on there, and the majority of people, sadly, will just get on and they'll try and identify, isolate, and argue extensively about every difference between coaches. Like, what's the difference between Matt and so and so and so and so and so and so. If you want the hack, find 30 different amazing coaches. Maybe look at who's Matt is following. Look who other coaches are following on Instagram. Find out who those coaches are. Find out maybe who those athletes are, and look for the similarities. So instead of doing what most people do is because if someone could find me doing something, Matt doing something, it's not gonna be hard to find a post where we seem to have something that's something conflicting, different. We could have a 30-second conversation about it. I'd be like, why do you do that? And I'm like, here's why I do that. And then we'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Or be like, all right, we'll agree to disagree, and that's the end of it. Or you could focus on the 99% of stuff we see eye to eye on. And if you took action on all those things, you're going to be freaking jacked, like really fast. So you find 30 good coaches, find all the stuff they agree upon, and just start enacting that. Like, that's kind of like not really ignorance. Like, that's the ignorance part is kind of cool and fun and nostalgia. But at the same time, like, I think that actually just doing stuff is the important part, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. Like, do you have to do bad stuff first? I mean, it's going to happen. That's fine. But if you can figure out, like, okay, all these people seem to agree on this stuff, I'm just going to get in the gym and start doing that. Things are going to go really, really well for you. And then, if you want to laugh at the people arguing about stuff that aren't acting and don't look like they work out, I mean, that's another thing. But that's the hack for you guys.
All right, guys, what's up? This is episode 43 of the Raw U podcast. We have Joe Bennett in town today. It's always good for me to see Joe, and we connect on so many levels outside of just a training. But obviously, with Joe being here, we're going to touch on training today. Mook has some questions for us, so let's get into it.
All right. I guess first, can you guys share just a bit about your background in training and like which field that you guys focus on?
Go for it.
Yeah. So my background in training is start with meathead origins. So I always say I'll try and keep this brief, but it won't be super brief. I don't keep anything brief. But I just started, literally my first exposure to it was Arnold's Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding. So my brother bought that book at some point in time, and I remember just literally looking at it and being like, holy crap, like people look like this. And just something like instantly clicked of obviously anyone that's, for me at that point in time, technically probably was through puberty, but didn't look like I was through puberty. The notion of like, I want to look like a man. And then something about everything bodybuilding just appealed to me. So like literally reading the way that Arnold wrote about stuff, the way that he wrote about the art of it, and obviously building something, creative something. Like I have a very my brain works very well with things that are like one piece at a time. Like, so I never minded things that were like long-term projects where I could see progress being made. So something about that just clicked from like day one. It's like, all right, like if I can curl now a 10-pound dumbbell, and then I can curl a 15-pound dumbbell, and then I can curl, and that's how I started working out. The very first thing before I could get to a gym was I would just do push-ups and concentration curls in my bedroom. And I literally I had to buy, I think I bought a 10-pound dumbbell first. And then every time I could do like 20 reps, I'd buy like a 5-pound more dumbbell and a 5-pound more dumbbell and try and do more push-ups every night. And so I could write a book about, I did every stupid, obnoxious bodybuilding thing that you could do. As soon as I had like a bicep that big, I bought medium shirts like that were really tight and walked around school with like a gallon jug. I used to like write my PRs on the board in high school. I'd do every project that was about bodybuilding, about Arnold. That carried through college as well too. I say in college, my dorm room, no joke, my dorm room had pictures of bodybuilders and Lord of the Rings stuff. So I say I was really popular with the ladies. They would love to see that. They'd come back to the room. Just kidding. My wife was the only one that thought it was cool, so it was meant to be. And but anyway, just like obsessed with it. I mean, I trained 3 times a day in high school, toned it down to 2 times a day in college. Got introduced to the idea. I was an exercise science major in college just because it had the word exercise in it, and I figured that maybe a grown-up, I had to be a grown-up. I was like, all right, I'm at college, but I like exercise, so here we go. And then got my first job in a gym there. Got out of school, went into corporate wellness, because that had the word corporate and wellness in it, which again, I was like, I like wellness, and corporate seems like something a grown-up would do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I said at that time, I didn't think I could actually make a living being a personal trainer, because I'd only ever trained at like hardcore bodybuilding gyms, because I like that. But the only trainers that worked there were like your stereotypical meathead trainers that were just, they'd train clients in like stringers and probably just making enough money to pay for their protein and whatever. And I was like, I need a real job. And I got introduced, luckily, to some people that, had a great, the company doesn't exist anymore, but very similar to like a lifetime model. And got me introduced to the fact that there were actually personal trainers that did this as a profession. Like I got around people that I was like, oh my gosh, like look at these guys, like how they carry themselves, how they treated their clients, how they treated it like a business. And I fell in love with it. I just absolutely loved every single part of it. Got into the business of training, eventually moved very quickly into managing training departments, managing trainers. But at its core, I always loved bodybuilding. So even though in the industry that was like, you can't make money in bodybuilding, keep it weight loss, general fitness, I always like gravitated towards helping clients build muscle. And long story short, to where I'm at now, I just stuck with that. And I just slowly, if you're passionate about something and you try and get better at it, that was just my growing demographic. So I've always just worked, my favorite is with people trying to build muscle. And obviously even eventually at the highest level, I just loved bodybuilding. I remember literally telling my wife, before she was my wife, I was probably 20 years old. She was like, we were talking about like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what's your ideal job and all that stuff. I literally told my wife, I think we weren't even engaged or anything at that point in time. I told her, I was like, well, like my dream job would be like training pro bodybuilders. And I was like, she didn't laugh at me, which was good. And then, but I literally told her, I was like, but Charles Glass already has that job, so I don't think I can do it though. It's like literally like that was the only dude that was like a personal trainer that was training pro bodybuilders. And it wasn't really, and honestly, even when I got into it, there wasn't really people focused exclusively on that. It was more like kind of like the gurus and people doing contest prep and stuff like that, which I just never had much of a passion for. But I was like, well, whatever, stick with it and do your thing. And luckily it's turned out to be something that I'm still able to do, obviously, to this day, is teach everybody about how to hopefully put on muscle, at every level. So,
yeah. I don't know if my story is as exciting as that, but really starting out, I think like Joe, my initial attraction started with my dad. My dad was working out, and then my dad still to this day loves Rocky movies. So if you actually look at the Rocky movies and in the series from 1 to 5, like you can, if you're drawn to this, like you see his progressive, the changes that he makes from one movie to the next, and that was something I was just drawn to very early on. Second thing, and I always give credit to this, is my best friend still to this day. We met in 7th grade. He's a year and a half older than me, but we were in the same grade. And he was just like extremely advanced. His dad was into training, and we actually, I tell this story because it's funny, but we did Leo Costa's Titan method in 7th and 8th grade, which I remember literally every single day. It buried me into the ground because I was not advanced enough for the programming at the time, but like that was like my base. And then I played soccer. That was my main focus in high school, was to play soccer. Ultimately, to get a scholarship, that's what I was going for in college. But every time that we were at a season, I would revert back to bodybuilding training as much as I could, just because I loved it. Ultimately, I did go to college to play soccer. I got injured my freshman year, and that was when I really started to shift my focus and just truly have a love for the gym, being in the gym all the time. I also was going to school for exercise science. And that was when, I initially started going to school for exercise science to be, to work in PT. I did a lot of, my mind just went totally blank, volunteer work in physical therapy offices. And what I noticed from them is that a lot of people are there because they're forced to be there and not because they want to be there. And ultimately, I wanted to work with people that wanted to be there, wanted to get better, and they weren't in an environment where, the healthcare or whatever was making them go. And that's where I really shifted my focus more so to bodybuilding. And I starting out, when I started coaching, I did my first show in 2010, and there was a local community, a very small local community of bodybuilders in the area that I grew up in Georgia, that just reached out to me to help them, I guess because I was like the first one to really do it, or maybe more so because of the fact that I actually got in condition. My first show I was 152 pounds. But I was in shape, So the first 2 male bodybuilders that I ever worked with at the time, they both turned pro, one in the IFBB and one in the IFPA, which is a national organization. He turned pro after working with me. I didn't work with him at the time. But again, like I was blessed with a really good initial crop of athletes that kind of helped me from the beginning, And I think that's one thing that I always try to allude to, is that I think every coach is given their opportunity, given their shot, and it's like what you do with that matters, and the time of which you do that. So that was really how it started for me. I graduated college. I did my internship at the University of Kentucky with their sports teams, which was an awesome experience, but also a very eye-opening experience for me, that I wanted to have the pressure and the expectation and the success of my career ultimately on myself and not rely on somebody else, So that again drew me back into bodybuilding, because I was making the consideration of, do I want to be like a sports and conditioning coach, because I think going the exercise science route, like the upper tier, the upper echelon of that is like to coach pros, whether that be football, baseball, basketball, whatever. And that's like kind of like the golden standard. But again, for me, after going through University of Kentucky's program, I just realized that like if I failed, I wanted it to be on me. If I succeeded, I wanted it to be on me. And that's when I went full time into coaching. When I got married to my wife, we moved up to Kentucky full time. And I started out working at a restaurant called Ted's Montana Grill. And I was doing their food prep work in the morning. And then I was also their janitor. So I was cleaning the restaurant before it opened up. And then after I got off of that job, I'd go to the gym. I come home and I do my coaching work. And I basically set that business up for as long as I needed to until I had the income to be able to coach full time. So that's kind of how I got my start. And then while I was up in Kentucky, I'm trying to tell these important stories because it really kind of helps the trajectory of what happened to me. But I was on the muscular development forums, and there was like this thread that was like the most hardcore gyms in America. And I saw Justin Compton comment in that thread about a gym called Ford's in Lexington, which was 15 minutes away from where I was. So I actually then went on, I believe, to Facebook. I messaged Justin and I said, hey, man, like I'm 180 pounds. I know I don't hold a candle to what you can lift, but I would love to have the opportunity to train with you one day. And he's like, sure, man, come out. And I'm pretty sure he said, sure, man, because that's how he talks. Mm-hmm. So he was actually 6 weeks out of the Chicago Pro at this time, which I believe was his pro debut. And we trained together that day. And after that day, he invited me to come back. He's like, honestly, I respect you a lot because you trained super hard and you didn't ask me anything about what I was doing, or you weren't trying to gain information off of me. You just showed up and trained hard. And that really was how I built my business from that point forward, was just about, showing effort and being about the effort in the gym that you can, because people want to latch onto something, whether it's, there's tons of things that they can latch onto, but like my business model from that point forward was just about hard effort in the gym, showing that proper execution, and then building a platform for there. So that's how I started.
Nice.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is kind of funny, as you talked about, that's a huge thing, because we were speaking too. A passion for mine is helping develop other trainers and bring them up in the industry and show them different paths and stuff that they can take. And that's a huge part of it that I talk about, is like you can have all this, you can take certifications, you can teach people the X's and O's of how to, do contest prep and things like that. But at the end of the day, there's going to be those points where like you got to like take your shot either to work with somebody, or then when you do get that opportunity, you also like don't mess it up. And I can say, if I look at, there's like pivotal points, I get a handful of them that were like massively important, where either like one, I, went out of my way to actually communicate with somebody. And then obviously when I had the opportunity, I, made the most of it as well too. And I had that like in my area, there were like hardly any bodybuilders in Sarasota area, but Jason Hull was down there. And so I used to kind of go out of my way just to like chat with him and talk with him. And then Ben Pekulski moved down to Tampa at one point in time for his, at that point in time, fiance. I literally saw him in my gym once. So I was like, there's that guy. I know who he is. And I remember literally seeing him at a gym and then going on my way to talk to him. And I found out he was going to be at the Tampa Pro. This is probably 2010 or something around then as well too. I literally invited myself to train with him. And same thing. I was like, I just, whatever. And I was probably like a, skinny fat 220 or something, nice mushy 220. And I invited myself to train. He basically said, sure. And if anybody knows Ben and what happens when you train with him the first time, he literally just like absolutely like murdered me. And I pride myself. I feel like I trained pretty hard, but it was just like over the top, like murder. And my whole thing though is like when I was in there, I was like, I'm just not going to say anything. At the time too, I was like natural, and like it was like a leg day, because he'd invite you for leg day first. And it was literally just like legit, like 3 or 4 working sets of like hacks of leg press or whatever. I was like, no matter what, I'm just not going to tap out. And so I literally went home, and he invited me back at some point in time. And it wasn't until like weeks later he was like, yeah, I was just basically seeing if you would like quit or not, to see if you get invited back. And then when more people would come and train with us, I'd see all the time when he's like, he'd be done with the session, he was like, he's not getting invited back or whatever. And I'm like, oh, all right. And that was kind of one of my first opportunities. Working with him led to a whole bunch of other things as well there too. But that was the whole thing at first. Is like I kind of said the same thing. Is like, I need to say it. My physique spoke for itself, or didn't speak for itself, I should say. But like went and trained hard and didn't quit. And then obviously we could have, dialogue about, oh, like I like training. I'd done a lot of continuing education with like similar people he had at that point in time. And but if I hadn't invited myself to train, and then also when I trained, if I had quit, which I wanted to do, who knows what would happen. I joked at the time as I would train with him every single weekend on was leg day. And I would literally take the entire week to recover for the next leg day. And it was only an hour drive, but I found out the first time I got out of the car on the way home, I literally like fell on my face. And so I would have to stop on the side of 75 between Tampa and Sarasota halfway every time and just walk around for a couple minutes and then get back in my car so I could function like, when I got home, so my legs would still work. So yeah, those were good times.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, even you talked about earlier about like you did everything wrong to start, but like that's the beauty in it. It was like the food choices that we made when we started, like we could probably do a whole podcast on like all the dumb stuff that we did, but like there's bliss in that, you know. And the same thing with like the opportunities that you guys are giving, you know, young coaches, like anybody listening to this, like you have to trust yourself enough to be, it's okay to fail, you know, but like you got to put yourself out there in a way that's respectful. I don't mean put yourself out there backstage at a show with somebody else's athlete, but I mean like, you know, in a way to prove that you're worthy of leading other people, you know, because ultimately that's what coaching is all about.
Nice. So the first question today is, how would you define effective training, and what are the key principles that apply across different domains?
I mean, I would define effective training as a system that's put in place that you can quantify progress off of, that you can pinpoint progress, whether that's weekly, bi-weekly, once a month, you know, there's different ways to do that, but that's what I would define as effective training. There's so many ways to do that, but ultimately that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing. I had a bunch of questions where everybody wants to ask. I get questions all day, every day about specific variables. It's like, what about drop sets? What about supersets? What about failure? What about whatever? And I say, everyone wants to ask those questions, but then even if I can create some context of what they may or may not do, the responsibility ultimately falls on them. Or if you implement it, are you tracking results? And that's why, because you'll get every single example from like the extreme of bodybuilding of like Paul Dillette, and like how he trained. If you guys don't know how he trained, he's like one of the largest human beings on earth that I don't think ever like picked up more than like 100 pounds. Just like everything was 20 reps short of failure. So we could talk about, hey, what's effective training? And you could look at how Paul Dillette trained and say, well, that wasn't effective if I try and create all these parameters. But he kept getting freaking bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, so it was effective for him. So ultimately, 100% what Matt says is like you have to start implementing something. You have to track progress and see if you're making progress. And if you're progressing, then it's effective training, you know. And then obviously progressing is what people say, how do I know if I'm progressing? Like there's your first problem. Like, do you take pictures? Do you get on the scale? Do you obviously measure things? Maybe do you look at your logbook? Do you see if you're getting better every single week? And if those things are happening, then you're progressing. And then there's the nuance component to that as well too, is you could split hairs about, could you progress faster? You know, you have to establish, you know, you're making progress first, and then you can maybe start to look at those variables a little bit more. And then the trickier one, in my opinion, is like, okay, well, what's working? Will your definition of work change? Like, meaning, will I be able to sustain this? Will my elbows be able to sustain this 10 years from now, 20 years from now? So most people that ask that question, I think 99% of people need to establish the baseline that Matt said, because it can be a billion different things. But as long as you can like establish that baseline and actually do that, like actually take action and do that, then there's nothing wrong with looking at some of the other stuff, as long as you realize that's after the fact, you know, create some context with that type of stuff. Because at the end of the day, like, again, you'll have genetic elite that people will like to sometimes pick apart their training. Like, oh, you never trained hard, you never trained to failure. It's like, what are you talking about? He trained just as hard as he needed to look like that. You know, and lots of times for a lot of guys, that's enough. And for some people, it's not. But you just want to be able to kind of create that context that it's going to be effective training can look very different from individual to individual.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. What was the second part of that question?
What are the key principles that apply across different domains?
Yeah, I mean, Joe said it, but like you need to, whether it's, you know, load on the bar, you know, load on the stack, like you need to be able to know which direction. I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is just not knowing or not remembering what they lifted the previous week. And then they just get in this repetitive pattern of doing the same thing over and over again. And they're like, well, I'm not making progress. Well, part of the reason why you're not making progress is because you're not aware enough of what you did the previous week, and you just continue to replicate it over and over again, you know? So there has to be some means of measuring, you know, whether that's food on a weight scale, whether that's your body weight on a body weight scale, whether that's, you know, the look in the mirror, the look in pictures. Pictures never lie. You know, if you guys have cosmetic goals or not, or you just have the desire to gain tissue for the sake of strength, I would still take pictures, because if you take pictures at the same time with the same amount of water volume in, you know, ideally with the same amount of sleep, it's going to tell the trends of what's going on. And it might not be a fast process. You know, even with me and my transition into a lot more cardiovascular training, one of the things that I've noticed is like your ability to progress cardiovascular and build fitness and a cardiovascular base is so much faster than what it is when you're gaining muscle, you know. But you just have to know like what the realm you're in, and then make sure that your goals and your, motivation or lack thereof isn't dependent on you just driving progress so fast that the second it falls off, then you're like at a wit's end of, oh, I don't know if this is for me. Because, for cardiovascular progress, that happens really quickly. So being that it happens really quickly, it's almost like an addicting process, because you can just get better so fast, at least if you're really green in it. But whereas with muscular and adding tissue, that's a slower process, so you just have to know what is realistic within a certain time frame, and then just make sure that you're tracking and monitoring, so that way, as Joe said, like, the rate of it, could you be progressing faster? That's always the question. But again, if you're a beginner, if you're, even intermediate, like, I think that you need to know quantify things on a monthly basis or even a 3-month basis, and then go from there.
Mm-hmm. I think part of that rolls perfectly into the next question too, is what role does motivation play into successful training?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define motivation. I mean, I think it's twofold. The short thing is obviously, what's your deep-seated, valuable, emotional reason for starting in the first place? Because there's got to be something there. And obviously the thing is, I think it is important to have it something substantial if you intend to do something for hopefully a long period of time, or a long enough period of time to actually see progress. But then also, like, progress is motivating, right? So some of that is the matter of, like, I don't know anybody on the planet, even like from having trained a bajillion normal people, where it's like they don't care at all. Like, all of a sudden can come in to lose 50 pounds. Obviously one seeing the scale drop a pound is motivating, but then also, like, is that more weight than I did last week? And I'll, like, look at their notes, like, yeah, you did 5 pounds more. Like, I've never met a person that wasn't like, oh yeah, like 5 more pounds in the bar is exciting for everybody. So there's, again, you could have a really long answer to that. So I think to start, there should be emotional things that are almost kind of separate from the gym. But again, even with those things, nobody wants to continue doing something, and no one will continue doing things if you don't see some form of progress as well too. So, that builds upon itself as well.
I think too, from just going off of what Joe just said, when you are looking at motivation, especially within bodybuilding, and, in my experience working with guys, the guys that are internally motivated and their main drive is internal for themselves, do so much better and far surpass the guys with the main driving factor is external motivation. I've seen that so many times. You look at, like, for example, you have the bodybuilder that is bodybuilding because he was picked on, or small, or maybe didn't have a father figure. And then you have the bodybuilder who is now looking for an outlet that was an athlete his whole life. So there's no sense of, I'm doing this because I'm trying to compensate, or because I was made fun of for my size, or I was fat, or I was too skinny as a kid. It's truly like them channeling, like, this is now my competitive avenue, because sports, or collegiate sports, high school sports, whatever that is, has stopped for them. And I've just seen so much more success with those people, because what's driving them is truly internal, versus the people where they're trying to continue to pull, because eventually you're going to run out of things to pull from. And your quote unquote haters that you're trying to prove wrong, like, eventually, like, that's just going to wear off, so you need to have something internally that's driving you for it to stick, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of that coming back to it as well too, is also with the question even prior to this, is that it's important to recognize that too, especially as a coach, is that everyone's coming from a different spot, and sometimes, some of the things that are easier for other people obviously won't be easier for some. And even when it ties into, like, the actual variables of, like, we're talking about, like, I've made the mistake before, because if anyone follows my stuff, like, I'll talk about some complicated stuff if somebody just wants to understand something better, or break down something better, or get into the weeds with the nuance or whatever. Because honestly, for me, it's like Matt said, like, when I started, like, training, I loved it. I was so internally motivated with all of it. And it's the cliche thing, but, like, nobody was watching. Like, not even, like, now people kind of say that as, like, do it in the shadows, but, like, and people say that while they're doing a post about it. And I was like, you're doing a post about it. You literally cannot say that. It's a self-defeating post or whatever. And I was like, but I was legitimately, like, I honestly never took progress pictures when I was younger, because I felt weird, and I didn't think I wanted to compete. I honestly wish that I had, but I just loved it. And honestly, I trained at hardcore bodybuilding gyms, so you were a weirdo. All the people that I idolized were weirdos. Like, everybody thought they were weird, and my whole family thought I was weird, and everybody at school thought I was weird. And especially I looked weird too, because I didn't even look like I worked out, but I was, like, obsessed with it. And but even, like, all those things about, like, the people say, which is such good sentiment and a good message, is like, the boring, like, a lot of bodybuilding is boring. Like, the basics are boring, but they are, you need to know that is all the foundation before you get into that nuanced stuff. And that's a little bit, honestly, sometimes I forget that because that stuff was easy for me. Like that stuff came first. Like I didn't ever like start training and be like, I can't wait to figure out the torque of this exercise. I never thought about that for like a decade, right? Like I literally just I liked more weight on the bar and like all those little, like just one piece at a time. Like that's how you should approach things, is one little thing at a time. So it's so easy for me to see, like I always knew form could get better. I always knew that I could put more weight on the bar. I always needed that I needed to eat more food if I wanted to keep growing. And so all those very basics, I never really had to have anybody teach me or think about it. And so sometimes when I'm like telling something nuanced or subtle or whatever, I'll kind of figure that all that's already there, but it's not. And even like at the highest level, I'll see some guys that like they don't realize that stuff needs to keep progressing in some way, shape, or form with a little bit of difference. I'm like, how do you not get this at this level, that like you're just not doing some of the basic stuff? Like I think Matt like says it really well. Like most guys like don't realize like they're like one off season away from like this drastic change if they just do things perfect. If you actually, like so many guys are at such a high level because they're not actually doing stuff perfect. And it's like from not having great genetics or whatever, and like actually looking like when I actually do stuff perfect, it's like, oh, holy crap, with not great genetics, I can make progress. If some of these, yeah. And that's the other thing too, like one of the better or worse times some people get into the sport, in some ways, some of the worst of it is the people get talked into it. Like, you know, it's like people, it's like, they just started working out. Like it just, I don't know everyone's origin story of how they started, but like, you know, imagine seeing Phil Heath doing a dumbbell curl. I'm sure like the first time he did a dumbbell curl, someone's like, hey bro,
the
you
gym owner
compete.
comes over and is like, man, you should really.
Yeah, like, exactly. Same with
yeah.
Ronnie Coleman, the whole thing. He walked in the gym with seeing his veins through his red sweatpants, and Brian's like, hey man, you should compete. It's like, sometimes that works out fine because the work ethic's there and they have the genetics, but sometimes it's like they're just so genetically blessed that like they don't have to work for so long, and then by the time they do have to work, I mean, I don't want to name names, but there's been a handful of bodybuilders over the past few decades that I think they were so genetically blessed that their level of effort, which wasn't that high, took them so far that when they actually needed a new level of effort, they wasn't there, and they couldn't do it. And you look from the outside, and like someone from me, like that doesn't even compute in my brain, where it's like, how are you cheating like the week before the Olympia? Or how are you cheating the day of the Olympia? And you couldn't, this is people that could have won the Olympia if they just stopped eating sandwiches and shit. Yeah. And it's like, but it's the, you know, the thought process and where they're coming from is just so different from where I came from and a lot of people come from. It's like that needs to be established in a lot of people right from the very beginning, regardless of where their, you know, genetics are at.
And then you have this group of people too, like the genetic elite, that I honestly think that some people do this because they know that they're good at it and not because they love it.
Yeah.
You know, so those are the people that like when push comes to shove and they have to find that extra gear, it's like it's nowhere to be found because their basis and their reasoning for doing this in the first place is because maybe the response was so great initially, but yet they never really loved it in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, I see that today. I mean, it's crazy.
I talked to you about this upstairs just a minute ago, and you said you had something to say about it. Oh. But when it comes to training programs, do you believe like a personalized plan or more general one size fits? Do you believe in a more personalized plan or a more general like one size fits all?
I'll tackle this one first. So I think I have several thoughts on this. I think one thing that needs to be considered is that everybody's recovery capabilities are different. So the more beginner you are, I do think that across the board, in most cases, exercise selection should be the same. But the frequency of that exercise selection based off of the individual should change. And that's part number one. And part number two is as people are learning how to train properly, the execution has to come first, and then everybody's perceived effort that they can push themselves is different. And that's also it's a learned skill, and some people have it more than others, and that just because you don't have it doesn't mean you can't learn it, but how quickly you learn that then goes into, again, the recovery capabilities. Because if you have, let's say if you can squat 400 pounds, and you're squatting 400 pounds for 8 reps, but realistically you could do that for 14 reps. Well, if you do it for 8 reps, you can do that more frequently because your capacity of pushing that set as near to failure isn't there versus the person that is taking that 400 pound squat for 14 reps. They're going to need more time to recover from that. So on the beginner, intermediate level, exercise selection, in my opinion, unless you have like some severe imbalance or there's something structurally wrong, it can be more consistent. And then when you reach that upper tier, that finite level, that's when exercise selection should be more individual, again, in my opinion. And then based off of the person's, and this is, again, going back to Paul Dillette, like he might have never seen a set to failure in his life, so his nervous system maybe never was taxed to the level of, let's say, a Jordan Peters or a Michaela Aycock or somebody, now that you guys are aware of, that trains super, super hard. So the frequency component, again, as well as the specificity within the specific exercises that they're doing, it should matter, So that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Yeah. Yeah, my answer for that was going to be both. And kind of for the reasons that Matt said. Like, one thing I always think is funny, especially, it depends on, who you're speaking to as well, too, like of who's doing the programming and what context of the programming. Because I always think my first thought often goes to, people that are actually training people in person. And, there's this, in the training industry, like, it's so overblown, especially even with general population, even outside of bodybuilding, with like this whole screening thing. And like, people, it's a great way to make money. People will do these insane assessments, that they're like all these 37-part assessments, and we can't have you squat until I look at your big toe mobility and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, in my opinion, that's ridiculous. It's a marketing thing. So I say, like, even if I have somebody in person, and if in the bodybuilding world, if I have somebody say, hey, I'm trying to bring up this body part or whatever it is, it's like, I don't need to get out like measuring tools and like go through 47 like things before I figure, all right, what's the best quad exercise for you? I already have like my Rolodex of like, most likely these are the places I'm starting. So for a lot of things, that's why I think that it's not actually bad. Like, people are like, oh, I have the same, your quad day and my quad day are the same. Like, our coach is giving us cookie cutter shit. And I'll be like, well, what do you want them to do? Like, give you what I think is a great workout, and I'm going to give you a different one, just so when you guys compare notes, it's like I'm not doing cookie cutters, Yeah. And that's why some coaches like to market that they don't do cookie cutter programs, and then literally ultimately I'm like, you're just making stuff up or just doing. Somebody's got a better program like that is better, or you're just trying to sound too fancy or too smart. Again, it's more of a marketing thing, So some of it is like with on paper stuff. It's something you just got to have a place to start. Like I said, especially for beginners, like, what are you going to like measure and what are you going to do or whatever. And that being said, the exception of, I think if you're going to customize things that really, and Matt did discuss, I'm kind of avoid the whole notion of, where you're beginner to advanced. Because like Matt said, there's a whole host of things, and recovery is such a huge thing that there's a whole bunch of different stuff in there as well too. But just as far as like a place to start, you're going to have so many people that start in the same spot, because why not? What's on paper is probably the least important part of what they're actually doing. And you're just going to start with places that are like, bigger, good opportunities to start that make the most sense. And then the individual component, in my opinion, does just come within the gym, because that's the same thing too, where it's like the classic. I could listen to him say it the same way over and over. But like when you hear Dorian talk about like his program, he's like, look at leg day. He's like, look at it on paper. You show it to somebody, you're like, what's that? It's like 4 exercises, like a set there, a set there. Like that's, like, show that to a new person. It's like, that giant guy looks like that, like because of that. You always just think, even the layperson just thinks more is better. It's got to be something crazy. It's got to be 8 billion sets or whatever. The thing that really sets people apart is how they do things. Like you said, the way Michaela Aycock does things is what sets her apart. It's not her program, and I write her program. But it's like, I'd like to say it's all the program. It's so awesome. It does everything. And but it's not what's on paper. It's what the person or how the person does it that makes the biggest difference. And that is where customizing does come massive. Where it's like, people have to be taught that. Like, there's never been a single individual ever in the history of me working with anyone, which is a lot of people, where they came in and I was like, you're good. I got nothing to say today. Keep up the good work. It's even if it's really subtle stuff, you can always improve form. And then there are subtle things, like you said, if there's orthopedic stuff, there could be a reason where people do need some degree of common sense, where it's like, this is bodybuilding blasphemy still for somebody, but not everybody has to touch the barbell to their chest. Now, the problem with me saying that out loud is a bunch of people looking for an excuse to cheat and use more weight. Or be like, Joe said it, and they stop 12 inches off their chest. But there can be real reasons to modify programs. Range of motion is just one example, but you can't write that for anybody. You actually have to get in the gym, look at form, look at execution, stuff like that. And that stuff's more subtle and just worth bringing up. But yeah, that's why I say both sides of that is, again, on paper, you could have 10 athletes have the same program, because what else you want me to do? But then obviously you get all those one-offs, and you figure out the little subtle things from there as well too. But it's how they do things that really separates the individuals, not necessarily the program.
Yeah, I would say, even within me coaching on a daily basis, I think where the specificity for a lot of my athletes comes in is you give them something that's set. You want to standardize a plan, and then based off of that plan, one of the biggest things that I'm toggling back and forth all the time is their ability to recover. Even going into the Olympia, you see now all these guys obviously are in a deficit. Obviously, it's all relative to their own body, but you see some guys that start to hold more inflammation than others, and that's all training induced inflammation. So how do you get that to clear? It's by recovering, by resting. So there's a lot of specificity in that. There's a lot of non-cookie cutter stuff. If you know what signs, symptoms to look for, whether it's, how they're digesting food, rate of progress in the gym is more often than not, I would say, is not the main sign. Because guys, especially guys that are mentally tough, the guys that are the elites in this sport, they can push through and still drive progress, but yet all the other variables, whether it's sleep, digestion, just how they're feeling throughout the day, how their body's flushing throughout the day, those can all be signs of poor recovery. So that's when you kind of need to toggle back the volume, or maybe just toggle back, the overall intensity. That's a big one. And then, going to this specificity of training programs, a great example from the Olympia that I can talk about. So Justin Shire, he's got a great front silhouette. He'll be the first one to tell you, as well as the clowns on Instagram, that his back's not where it needs to be. So now you have a top 20 bodybuilder in the world that his legs need to come up and his back needs to come up. So that is going to be the specificity for this year. But even within saying that, I have text messages. Like, I still am very basic in like how we're going to accomplish that. And I text him something. He's like, man, that's crazy. I told my wife the same thing yesterday. Like, I want him to be able to deadlift 600 pounds for 10 reps, and then that be a consistent thing. And then we monitor progress from there. This year he was basically hitting in the 500 range, 540 range, I think, for 8. So if we're now progressing that to 60 plus pounds, adding 2 reps to that, and then he's consistently hitting that week over week, as rep ranges change or whatever, and then the variables within that change. But like if he's able to do that for 8 months straight, like that's going to correlate to a different look to his back, a denser look to his back, which is what he needs. He just needs more hardness there. And hardness comes with maturity to the tissue. So we have to get that maturity there to then bring that harder look to the stage, And for those of you guys that don't know Justin, he's like so green in this. He's a little bit older. I think he's 36, but his bodybuilding age is super young, and he before his bodybuilding age, he wasn't harsh on his body at all. So it's like we still have a lot of those variables to toggle and play with. So that's, in my mind, where specificity really comes into play.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that too, and this is the problem with all information, is people will use it properly or misuse it. Is when people, again, that's where people say like stick to the basics, but then they kind of take that out of context. Whereas like, for a perfect example too, which is kind of a little bit what you're talking about, but a little different as well too, is like if I'm looking at like what's a good like flat chest press motion that'll get somebody a huge chest. Like I could list 8 different motions that are, for the most part, I mean, I could teach courses about why they're different, but for the most part aren't that different. Flat barbell press, flat dumbbell press, flat machine press, whatever. And there's how many different machines are there or whatever. So if I have an athlete that for whatever reason flat dumbbell press isn't working or doesn't feel good or doesn't work well, so try this flat machine press. Or if their certain squat, barbell back squat doesn't feel good, how's a safety squat feel? That doesn't feel good, how's a hack squat feel? That doesn't feel good, how's a pendulum feel? So there's going to be like a large amount, in my opinion, of relatively interchangeable movements that, based on an athlete's feedback, even if I could argue this one's slightly more optimal or whatever crap, based on the athlete's feedback, like Matt said, it doesn't, most of the time, again, there's someone will take this information wrong, but if you can go from hack squatting 6 plates for 10 really pretty to 9 plates for 10 really pretty, your quads are going to get bigger. You don't have to do a back squat or anything like that as well too. So while like the basics of progression and all those things are there as well too, I do see people sometimes doing more harm than good by feeling like they have to do the basics. And especially when like stuff can grow. I'll see guys that are doing free weight squats because they feel like they have to for their quads, where their quads would grow doing anything, and then they could do that and not have back issues or hip issues or whatever. Yeah. So it's, again, that's the tricky information where there is, and that's stuff to figure out with a coach, and sometimes with the hardest working individuals too. It's like sometimes as a coach's job is to let them know that's okay. You don't have to barbell back squat. We know you're hardcore and awesome and would do that if you had to until everything exploded, but let's just do a hack squat instead and still get huge quads and save along the way. So there is places for, that's hopefully people can understand both sides of that, why some stuff is just going to be the same because got to start somewhere. But then there's a whole host of places where customizing, I think, can be beneficial for the athlete, of course.
So plateaus are pretty common in training. How do you recommend people overcome plateaus to continue making progress?
There's like, this is could be a long question. So I would say plateaus are again, because, I mean, there's so many ways we could take this, but assuming that your nutrition's right and your recovery's right, let's just get those as set variables that you are doing well. Plateau could be because you're under recovered. You maybe been pushing the bar too far too long and you need to pull back. Or again, going back to what we said earlier about just like actually really not paying attention to the variables in what you're doing. Or you could be, this is a big one, I think, especially for a lot of beginners, is that they're over warming up. So they're causing too much fatigue in sets that actually don't really matter, like junk volume, for lack of a better word. And then that's limiting their ability to progress their top end sets, the sets that really matter for them to progress long term. So I think there's so many ways to answer this question, but really consider, again, like let's say if your sleep and recovery is on point, your nutrition's on point, and you are now at a plateau and you are training hard. Let's say you are training hard. My first go-to is to pull back on the volume first. That's going to be always my first go-to. Again, assuming all those other variables are set. Now if you're somebody who, you're not following consistent rep patterns in the gym, or your recovery's off, you have to start to quantify and align which variables are off or which variables aren't off, and then go forward from there. But in most cases, I would say for hard training individuals that start to plateau, either pull back on the volume. And another thing I like to do is if I know they're training hard and they maybe are recovered, is I like to bring the rep ranges like way back up. So let's say if they're stuck at like a set of 6 to 8 and they just can't put more weight on there. I like to build the rep scheme back up to like maybe 15 to 18 and then set the progressions in place from there. And then once they accomplish, let's say if they start at 15 and they build a weight at 15 up to 18 reps, and then we add weight at 50 or at once they get up to 18 reps, and then you build the rep range down to, let's say, 12 to 14 now. You start at a set of 12, surpass that 14 to hit 15, and then ideally by the time you get back down to that 6 to 8 rep range, you should be able to surpass it by that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to second. The only thing maybe because I agree with obviously everything Matt said, just to add some different things to think about with that as well too, is again, it's so huge on who's asking the question. I think that's the biggest part, because it's tough to obviously say and create all these different scenarios. Because I would say that speaking to like the average gym bro or gym gal that's asking the question, that has the idea that they're like, everything is a matter of grinding and smashing, and how hard can I go and just smash it in the gym and get after it in the gym or whatever. Most of those people, I would say, because the assumption is you've stalled, means that you were making progress. I'd say most of the time I look outside of the gym would be the first place for a normal person, because most people, and from my own personal experience and with a billion normal people training, that's kind of an afterthought. Most people enjoy training more so than weighing out their food, right? So it's most of the time when I look at what are you doing, it's like the same guys that could get away with, they got drunk the night before and then they trained arms the next day or whatever it was. And like literally, like a lot of young guys in college are still going out. Like you look at their actual schedule and it's like, well, you've just got to the point where like everything in training goes like this. Everything goes to a point of diminishing returns, including recovery. And so it's like, yeah, at some point in time, you might be able to go out and drink 2 or 3 times a week and still make progress. But at some point in time, that comes to an end, stop, and it's come to an end. So it's like we might look at and then at some point in time, again, like they're just, how many people ballpark, you have guys who are like, I just can't put on weight. And that just means they eat what they perceivably feel like is a lot, which is obviously like, if you're not putting on weight, you're not in a surplus. And then they'll tell you, no, bro, I eat a lot. I'll be like, no, you're just not in a surplus. Because even if you were in a surplus and not training hard, you'd at least be getting fatter. And so if you're not getting fatter, you're just not in a surplus. So, I always look at recovery first for normal people. Like how serious do you take your sleep? How serious do you take your food and all that kind of stuff? And the same thing too, just creating context. If you don't care about that stuff like that much, if you're like, well, I want to go out and party and I want to do all this stuff, and be like, well, great, then this is your spot for all that stuff right now. You're going to be stalled or not making progress. So I like to look at recovery. And then like Matt said, is like everything in the gym is to a point of diminishing returns. So it's some people, they haven't had to look at things as precisely as they need to in a beginner, because they have a larger margin for error, right? So like you said, when you get in the gym in the beginning, it's like, especially for the genetic elite, it's like, I put 45s on, put an extra 25 on, then another 25, then another 45. And then some like big people, you have to be like, there's these things called 10s. And then for normal people, you have to teach them about 5s and 2.5s. And for some really normal people, you have to teach them about micro progression. And so at some point in time, it's like, it doesn't matter who you are, your performance in the gym can progress for a very, very long period of time, but it always goes to a point of diminishing returns. So you might just have to progress at smaller margins. And then that's the whole simplified version of training, is all stimulus and recovery. So if you address recovery For the hardest training individuals, which again, like Matt said, we actually get around some of those people. That's where I think low volume can work well. Great too. Like a great thing to pull back is like you've just got too much stimulus and too much of the stimulus that's not as important. Intensity. Like what are you actually able to do on those PR sets? Like Matt gave the example of Justin and what he didn't say how many sets he was doing, 600 for 10-4 or whatever. Because that doesn't matter as much as the fact that he's going from 500 to 600 for 10. Right. So that just goes to show that even him saying that and me agreeing with that is that intensity, which is defined with what you can do within one set first and foremost, is more important than the volume you can do. And like you said, if you're doing a lot of junk volume, you might restrict the level of intensity that you could actually hit. So that's why I think I've seen the pattern a lot. I'm sure Matt has as well too. A lot of athletes, especially as they get more experience, stimulate a new level of growth going to a lower volume approach. For a lot of reasons, but some of it is they might have literally just maxed out with the level of stimulus they're putting in. It doesn't matter what they do with the recovery. You just actually need less of that type of stimulus, which allows more for the type of stimulus that's arguably more important anyway. So, it really depends on the individual asking that question. But there's, and I think that's the big thing as well too. Some people don't again, the genetic elite, sometimes even the elite of the elite, they don't like the fact that they have to get that much more precise with everything. It's like, well, this is what you've always done and progress at this rate. It's like, if everyone, I've always seen that from the beginning, it's always in my brain, so it never surprised me when it comes, but something athletes I don't think know is you're going to have to get more precise with everything if you want to keep progressing. I don't care who you are, and some people just don't really necessarily, realize what that looks like or what that means. But I think that's just something that people have to realize is a training reality.
Dallas was one of those 45 and 25 guys when I first started training with him.
I used to joke about that. I don't think I ever saw him touch anything smaller than a 25.
Set number 4 was 400 pounds on the bar already. I'm like, all right, here we go.
Imagine if somebody just trained that precise just from the beginning.
Yeah. There's good and bad.
As a beginner.
I know that's half of it too. I think that's like what Matt said. It's great to actually figure out, because when I first started training, I didn't care about nutrition at all. I didn't care at all. People I remember literally even talking at some point in time to a trainer at some gym that was just being nice to me, and he was talking to me about what I was eating, and I just remember being like, why does that matter? I mean, I kind of had this vague notion, but I was like, who cares, man? I just want to lift weights and put more weight on the bar. And it's like sometimes you just have to figure that out for yourself.
Yeah.
And but then I also joked that as well too. Crap, I was going to say something about. You go ahead, Matt. I'm going to come back to something about that per se. Oh, no, that's the one thing I was going to say. Is the one thing I'll say too for athletes as well too, and I was guilty of this honestly when I competed as well. Is a lot of people aren't nearly as precise too in their off season as they are pre-contest. And it's like if people are really, really, really honest with themselves, again, depending on how important it is to you, imagine if everybody treated their off season just as meticulous, literally measured, weighed everything, did everything. If you had to, I'm not saying that obviously you couldn't have some extra junk in there or whatever here and there, or off plan meal or whatever. But again, if everything's moving to the point of diminishing returns, there's lots of people that just go wild in their off season and just kind of ballpark a lot of stuff. Where at some point in time, you might just have to get precise and meticulous with all of it as well, too. I don't know if it would be good or bad to start just like that. So I've seen some people that jump right in the deep end, and it actually mentally is probably not that great of a thing to do.
Yeah, you have those people, too, which, drive me crazy. But, they're asking about, EPA and fish oil, but don't know how to take a set to failure, so there's different things that you need to consider within what are you really prioritizing and and what are you not, and what actually needs your attention and what doesn't.
I'm not the professional here, but I feel like if you're measuring everything the way that you measure it in season, pre-show or pre-prep, I feel like your prep would be easier if everything was measured the same way that you measure it going into the contest.
It should be, yeah, for sure.
How has technology impacted the training landscape, and what tools or apps do you recommend? How has technology impacted
training? I thought
training?
this was like an Instagram question.
No.
Tools that is technology.
Yeah, I don't know. Is that a question where they're literally asking about what apps to use to help training, or they're asking us our opinion on
just overall
social media?
I think just overall, how has technology impacted training? And I guess maybe apps too, kind of like your training, where you're using your computer and you did the testing for the sodium and all that stuff too.
Yeah.
So I guess all of that technology.
Yeah, let's just talk about bodybuilding. In bodybuilding, whether you want to log things on a book and be old school, or whether you want to log them on a phone, what I think really matters is if that's your method of progress, that you're consistent with it, and then whichever whichever method you enjoy the most that you'll actually stick to, and then that also won't be a distraction for you. I think that's the big factor in technology is it yielding in the goal, or is it distracting you from the goal? And then again, I'll just bring in social media to this. I think going back to like motivation and your why, I think now bodybuilding is a lot more externally motivated, driven factors because of what people are seeing on social media, and then their rate of which they're seeing other people accomplish things makes them discouraged when they're not accomplishing at the same rate. But the reality is you don't know when the pictures were taken. You don't know the frequency in between pictures. Like there's so many things that you don't know. You don't know if people are stockpiling images. There's so many things that I think are ruining like the ignorance is bliss that we talked about, whether that's, going to Waffle House every time after you train, which was one of the things that I did, and then getting home and then drinking a Mass Triple X shake and just like literally watching myself get fatter, but yet I was enjoying technology is improving bodybuilding. I think it could be making it more convenient for some people that struggle with tracking or struggle with sticking to a program to have, maybe they're better at, using their phone or a book or vice versa. But I really don't think, in my opinion, that technology has improved bodybuilding.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like anything. I would honestly lean towards the side. Well, first off, if it was asking about apps and stuff for training, I mean, you don't need any of that stuff. Like I said, how I track my workouts is so random too. It's all written in different spots. Sometimes it's literally like I have an app and I'm saying that. Sometimes my workouts are in my own personal app. Sometimes they're in my notes section. Sometimes they're written on paper. Like at home, I have a dry erase board. I don't even have a dry erase board in my garage. I almost got a dry erase board. Then I realized the freezer in my garage is like the same surface. So my logbook right now is on the freezer lid in my garage. It works great. But anyway, but as far as he's saying, specific to like the social media, overall, I feel like it is a little bit more of a negative impact. But there's obviously, just like anything, there are a few really good things about it. But like some of it is, I feel like you said, the worst part about, I think this is a bigger picture thing, a bigger picture in life thing, is like you don't know what your calling is supposed to be, and you're looking at the perceived end result of someone else's calling maybe. Like the worst thing is like, looking at Bumstead and being like, I want to be another Bumstead. It's like if your goal is to be another Bumstead, you are doomed for like depression. Like it's the worst thing ever. And same as anybody, Phil Heath, Ronnie, whatever, like, oh, that's what I want to be like. It's like, dude, that is the worst goal ever. Like, dude's already taken. But you don't know what you're supposed to be. Because honestly, I joke when the way I fell into things that I was meant to do and have purpose and get, a lot of joy from is from like when like I said, I did all the meathead stuff at first. I didn't think about what a muscle did or like mechanics or anything like that. I just liked all the meathead stuff. And then it came from like all my training partners got bigger faster than I did in high school. Then same thing happened in college. And then when I was like meeting like, oh, like this pro bodybuilder, oh wait, crap, we're the same age and he looks like that. Like I realized like when I was looking at magazines when you're a teenager, like, oh, they're all old and pro bodybuilders. And as soon as I knew some that were the same age, and I was like, what the hell, man? We're not the same. And I remember half complaining about it at when I first started working as a trainer. I literally had a boss tell me, it's like, bro, he's like, don't you realize like that's why you're a good trainer? He's like, because you actually, and that's literally when I started to actually think about stuff. Is like, maybe I can't do the exact same thing as Arnold and expect the same, chest or the same bicep or the same whatever. And as a result of not thinking that I had to be Arnold or I had to be Bumstead or I had to be whatever, I was just kind of going through the stuff that I was doing and working hard. I found out, it's like, oh, I'm supposed to be a trainer, right? And so what someone could feel, and there's a lot of great examples. I read a bunch of like Tony Dungy stuff. Like you would ask him, you think he was supposed to be playing in the NFL and had like had his dreams crushed, and then ended up working out already. Oh, he's supposed to be a coach and he's supposed to be a Super Bowl winning coach. There's a billion examples of that. It's the same thing in our industry. If you get fixated on that end result and think that that's what you're after, you have to have, you might be missing what you're really supposed to be doing. So there's some negatives that go along with that. But then the only thing I think is good as well too, is I don't think it were as through as much of a filter of where it all came from before. I was talking with Chris briefly about it. It was like the only thing we had even before like forums were even much of a thing was like the bodybuilding magazines. And so it was like, that's where you got all your information from. And that's where I copied everything from. Arnold's Encyclopedia and then bodybuilding magazines, which was the same thing written over and over and over and over and over and over year after year after year. And so while we have the issues of maybe over information now, you can actually find, like, I can go follow Matt, and like Matt's not like lying on anything. He just puts out, here's what I'm doing, gives a lot of good information. You can follow like real coaches and real athletes, a lot of them that are being like honest and transparent, and you can actually start, depending on who's receiving the information. That's the tricky part. I think you can actually find way better information than you could before, because like literally before it was like you just did what everybody repeated what you were told. You know, you didn't really have any way or as easy of a way to get access to people that are actually, you know, thinking in the field, producing results, and not just through these one specific things. So it's a lot to navigate. But again, that can be taken two ways, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that is the one thing. So from a technology perspective, like what Joe's saying, like I don't think in today's day and age that we have an excuse to be bad at things anymore.
Yeah.
You know, because as long as you can decipher what is good information from what's not good information, you can fast track things. Now, again, I still think that ignorance is bliss is like what part of what makes the beauty of bodybuilding what it is. But like you can also just fast track the mistakes, because again, like talking about my origin story. So really, my dad's training background was all dependent on his high school football coach, you know, and whether that guy had any real knowledge or not, you know. So basically, my dad was a byproduct of that, and then I ultimately started out as a byproduct of, again, his high school football coach. You know, so we're not in that environment anymore. You know, we can seek out and get good information. So in that way, I think technology is great. You know, but like in terms of is technology specifically making bodybuilding better? I mean, I guess you could go either way, because I just said yes. Yeah. But it just depends on which way of technology you're looking at, I suppose.
I'll give you guys the hack right now for the people that, for anyone out there actually wanting to get better, especially someone that wants to be a better coach. Here's the hack, because people get on there, and the majority of people, sadly, will just get on and they'll try and identify, isolate, and argue extensively about every difference between coaches. Like, what's the difference between Matt and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? If you want the hack, find 30 different amazing coaches. You know, maybe look at who's Matt is following. Look who other coaches are following on Instagram. Find out who those coaches are. Find out maybe who those athletes are, and look for the similarities. So instead of doing what most people do is like, because if, again, someone could find me doing something, Matt doing something, it's not going to be hard to find a post where we seem to have something that's something conflicting, different. We could have a 30-second conversation about it. I'd be like, why do you do that? And I'm like, here's why I do that. And then we could be like, oh, that's interesting. Or be like, all right, we'll agree to disagree. And that's the end of it. Or you could focus on the 99% of stuff we see eye to eye on. And if you took action on all those things, you're going to be freaking jacked, like really fast. Like you find 30 good coaches, find all the stuff they agree upon, and just start enacting that. Like that's kind of like not really ignorance. Like that's the ignorance part is kind of cool and fun and nostalgia, but at the same time, like I think that actually just doing stuff is the important part, right? Yeah. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. Like, do you have to do bad stuff first? I mean, it's going to happen. That's fine. But if you can figure out like, okay, all these people seem to agree on this stuff, I'm just going to get in the gym and start doing that. You know, things are going to go really, really well for you. And then, you know, if you want to laugh at the people arguing about stuff that aren't acting and don't look like they work out, I mean, that's another thing. But that's the hack for you guys.
In what ways does training contribute to mental health? Are there specific types of training that are particularly more beneficial for that?
So just for me, this is a more personal thing. I notice, my wife notices, my family notices that when I'm in the gym or when I have a goal that's pushing me and I'm having to exert myself, mentally I'm just a happier person. And I've never even, you know, I think the awareness of mental health is more prevalent now than it ever was, especially, you know, maybe it's the environment that I grew up in, or maybe because thankfully I had a really good childhood, and, you know, like these mental health issues wasn't a part of my ecosystem. But I think as I've grown older and I'm aware of like what mental health is for me or what mental health is for my wife, and, you know, what triggers a healthier response versus a negative response, I just know that I'm a happier individual when I can get into the gym. Now, with that being said, one thing that I have to navigate now is all the things on my plate, and, you know, all the plates that are spinning, is not causing stress by the gym taking away from other responsibilities that I have, you know. So that's something else that I have to navigate. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, just for me personally, I just noticed that through having a set goal and being able to work towards something, or maybe just something being very hard for me that I have to like really sink my teeth into, that just allows the other aspects of my life to be better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think there's any type of training. I mean, science-y, you could maybe make some different arguments here or there that's definitively better or worse for mental health. Obviously, I just think the physical challenge is just, challenging yourself. And obviously, the physical realm is a great way to, everyone should have some sort of goal and some sort of challenge. And then honestly, the physicality of that as well, too, it just seems to do a lot of really good stuff for your body. So I think that's a big thing as well, too, man. Is like people, I do think, with rare exception, and even with that, sometimes people just need a bigger picture, is like you should love training or try and find something you love as much as possible, or at least hate the least, whichever way you want to look at it. And then realize, because that's the tough part in the bodybuilding world, and then I'm grateful for my background, just having trained, I mean, literally like so many normal people, like people that are broken, post-rehab, people that are in their 90s that I've trained, is it's given me good perspective. I think it's a big thing too for, if you're a coach, if anyone pays you for training in any way, shape, or form, or if you're an educator, anyone looks for your expertise, your job first and foremost, your most important job is managing expectations. You should never look at training through a lens of right or wrong. You should look at it through managing expectations. If you do this, here's the most likely outcome. There's no guaranteed outcomes. And I think when you have that lens too, that there's nothing wrong you can do with training, right? So again, if that's just where it's so important, when maybe at some point in time you were always a bodybuilder, then you stopped bodybuilding, or you were having this specific goal, then you had another goal. And that's good too, because it's like, what if you just want to go do something? We talk about, like, I just want to go, and I overtrained with Ben Pekulski for how many years? Like, I just way overtrained for years. But like, looking back, did it maybe not help my physique as much as it possibly could have? Probably. But I'm more enjoyed that process for years than the extra 6 pounds of muscle I could have had maybe, or who knows what. And the same thing now is like, where I go into a gym now, my goals are completely different. And again, like he said, your schedule is different, your goals are different. My expectations when I look at training, I look at what are my bigger expectations with life and where does training fit within that. But what do I still expect out of training? And like, I just need to train with some degree of frequency, so now I'll have it like, if I can train for 20 minutes, that's something I would never do before. It's like, before, my life revolved around my workouts. Like, my workout was scheduled and everything else worked around that. And it might be, here's the things I'm doing for half an hour before my workout, and here's the workout, and here's the time afterwards. If it was leg day, don't do nothing for 6 hours after that or whatever. And now it's like, I'm like, if I literally have, that's the reason I have I built a gym in my garage first and foremost for my wife, and I end up using it all the time now, because it's like, I'd rather do 20 minutes of something than nothing. And so those are great conversations to have with your clients as well too, because goals change and goals shift. And if you're a coach or an educator, you should be, for handling the X's and O's and the nuts and the bolts, is manage those expectations, but make sure you really connect with the people about, like, well, if they want to do something that makes them happy, you can sign off on it. Even if it's something stupid, like there's some people that want to do, like, I want to do this. And I was like, well, technically on paper, you don't need to break yourself that much to have that outcome or whatever. But if you really enjoy that and you're fine with that, then good, I sign off on it, because I didn't say it's orthopedically good for you. I'm not going to lie to you. But if it's mentally good for you, have at it. So there's a whole host of things under there as well too. And that exists in, like, little bits as well too. You could have a pro bodybuilder trying to compete at the Olympia that still has some stuff that he likes to do that's not perfect on paper, because it's fun, because they like it, because whatever. And again, with exceptions of, obviously, I'm not saying, someone tell me they want to throw power snatches in 6 weeks out from the Olympia or something. I'm like, bro, just wait till you retire or something.
Yeah,
yeah.
All right. The training across different life stages, how does, you have some experience with this already too, but how does the approach to training change across different life stages, youth, adulthood, into seniors?
You want to hit this one first?
Yeah, sure. Well, so if we're asking about youth and adulthood, I mean, one I always say for, because I love the idea. People always ask me, do you want your kids to, like, bodybuild or whatever? And I was like, I don't want them to do anything. I want them to exercise. And like, for a lot of reasons, I actually, like, don't want them to bodybuild, but I'd be supportive if they got into it. So I think at a young age, really, really hammering on enjoyment, but also while having some of the same stuff you should be teaching kids, like discipline and work ethic. But again, there's like a million different ways that you can make that somewhat enjoyable. With my kids, I try and teach them, like, it's great. They see me doing stuff, so they want to work out with me. And then honestly, from the nuts and bolts of it, kids can work out as soon as they're coordinated enough to work out, and they can use weight as soon as they're coordinated enough to hold weight. So, my kids, you can buy cheap, $5 pound, like these little mini Olympic bars. And so I've, like, literally put a barbell in my kids' hands as soon as they want it. And then as soon as they can show me they can do something with, the coordination that it takes, then you can put some little weights on the side. And if you coordinate with that, then we can put some more weights on the side. So, but it could be, obviously they play sports. So it's like, I try not to keep it. I like the idea of teaching them, like they already get like, can I put more weight on this time? So like, that's already there. I don't need to teach them that. They want to get stronger and all that kind of stuff. But so the earliest stages, it's about coordination. If they're coordinated enough not to hurt themselves and do things properly, then you train them the exact same as almost anybody else if they're really into it. But it's just more about, I think, the enjoyment, adherence, and just some basic life principles at that point in time. And then for everybody else, obviously we won't hammer on bodybuilding because we already did that. But then I think the most important, again, for everybody is just consistency. Consistency, that's the name of the game. And, I think it's something that goes well through bodybuilding, and I think actually gets neglected a little bit, but especially post-bodybuilding into the rest of your life is, for lack of a better word, people don't put enough focus on mobility. And maybe some of it is because I think that area is very over-marketed and made it seem like it's some sort of complicated thing. But there's little stuff that I've been doing my whole bodybuilding career where it's like, aside from bone degenerative diseases, osteopenia, osteoporosis, like why do people when they're old can't lift their arm over their head? Like people don't realize like how much when you have someone that's like 80 years old can't lift their arm up, because literally at some point in time they didn't have to reach anything that high and they just didn't lift their arm up that high. And then at some point in time, you will lose the ability to lift your arm up that high. Your muscles will that's probably the only time muscles actually change length, or your brain's ability to tell muscles to go there. So I think as it gets older and older, like the consideration of mobility is massive as well too, where if you just consistently do things, you won't lose it. Most people lose it because they stop doing things. And one of the saddest things you see is in older populations, one of the worst predictors of when the end of your life isn't going to go well is when someone breaks a hip. And it's when people that they don't have any controlled structure, any idea of training, they're so worried about misstepping that they slowly make their gait smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you see that's why old people shuffle. But that's in some ways the worst thing you can do, because the second you shuffle more than 6 inches, your brain doesn't know what to do out there anymore. And that's when someone falls and breaks their hip or whatever. So it's little stuff as well too I think about all the time. Honestly, with myself, with my parents, is consistency. Doesn't take a whole lot of work. But especially for that life stuff, that mobility stuff, if you just do something consistently, you won't lose it, and your quality of life will be, drastically, better and better as you obviously get into older ages as well too. But
I think Joe answered that very well. I think really what it comes down to, and this almost like transcends the life cycle, is just something that challenges you and something that you enjoy. Mm-hmm. And if you can knock out those two factors, I think we as humans, we were created to do things that are challenging and that are hard. And by doing that, you're going to keep your physical body in a better state, and I think I truly believe in that. It's like you hear the story of, like, especially with men, it's like, when they retire, it's like that's when their life really goes down, or their health really goes downhill. Mm-hmm. Was it the retiring, or was it just them, just really becoming more sedentary? So again, that comes down to, as we age, just doing things at that point in our life that still challenge us, but yet that we still enjoy. And I also think there's enjoyment that comes from doing hard things, if everything else in your life is aligned and in the right spot. And I don't mean like hard physical challenges is what I mean. So that's what I think it really comes down to, again, whether it's, you're a child and my boys are starting to see. Also, as adults, if you guys have the ability to have some type of home system set up where you can work out at home and be that example for your kids, the kids are going to latch onto that much, much earlier, So it's been cool to see. But yet, all I'm trying to do with my boys is create an environment where they feel encouraged by doing hard things. Not making things so hard where they're discouraged, but just accomplishing little tasks that encourage them to continue to want to do hard things. And then really that just, again, talking about, progression as you age and as you get older and as you get stronger, just again, making those tasks a little bit harder. So that way you still have to push yourself to accomplish something.
Nice. So final questions, like a 2-part question. What advice do you have for someone who is just starting in their training journey, and how can beginners avoid common pitfalls and stay motivated in their early stages of training?
What's that saying about basically like comparing yourself to others is
comparison's the thief of joy.
Yes, yeah. That I think is ultimately what it comes down to is is making it an internal thing about, what you're going to do to get better and not comparing yourself to others. I think that's a huge part of it. And then also just, again, like, people ask, Joe's been asked so many times, I've been asked so many times, what's the best training program? And my answer to that is always what you can stick to and adhere to, so really what it comes down to for you guys that are younger is stop comparing yourself to people that are, even I did it, but like I did it again out of internal motivation, not external motivation. But, going back to my buddy Jim, like the amount of muscle that he carried in 8th grade was honestly insane. So like if I were just to look at him and be like, oh man, like there's no way I'm going to look like that. I mean, it took me until I was 24 to look like he did at, in 8th grade. So it's like, it's all relative, and understanding that it's all relative and it's about achieving your personal best and it's not somebody else's personal best. And if you can actually like truly believe that and truly get that into your head, and then going to the actual training aspect of this, like do what you love that's going to challenge you, that also is going to produce results, because even within my crop of athletes that I have now, do I believe that maybe training 4 or 5 days a week is ultimately the best thing? Yeah, I do. If I have all my guys train 4 or 5 days a week, do I know that they're going to still love bodybuilding to the extent that they do right now? They won't, so it's about finding that common denominator of what's driving progress, but also what they enjoy or what's keeping them mentally stable. There's so many different variables that come into it, but like, don't compare yourself to others. Do something that you can stick to, that you enjoy, and ultimately that's going to bring you success long term.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with all that. Like that's where I think it's good to have a very logical approach to things. It's a tough thing to tell people because again, you don't ever want to have this like defeatist attitude or whatever, where it's like, right away you're like, oh, I'll never be like Bumstead, I'll never be whatever. But it's cliche, but it's like if you can be, because like literally that's when I started. Like I just started working out and I didn't think anything about other people, but then real quick it was like, why are my buddies benching more than me? Why does somebody look like this? And I honestly like figured out within the first couple of years, like, okay, like I've heard people say genetics and genetics is a thing. I literally thought at the same time, I was like, well, I mean, if I work out long enough, I'll eventually be bigger. And like, that was the end of that. I literally never like looked back or felt bad about it ever again, or like looked at somebody else and like, I'll joke about it even now. Like, I'm sure, man, I'll look at somebody like, must be nice to train arms and they look like that. But if you can just look at it and observe it is what it is and like have a laugh about it, great. But like, I latched on and I love the part that it's like, well, I can keep getting better. And whatever that looks like, I would just always focus on that thing. And so like Matt said, I think that's so huge in training, whatever you do. And I think having something where you can, the way that you keep it logical and not, in this emotional thing or this qualitative thing is like we said, like you got to write stuff down. You got to have something quantitative where it's like, if you can be feeling bad, but if you look at your logbook from 6 months ago, it's like, I would look at books and be like, holy crap, like I forgot that I was like just doing dumbbell press with 40 pounds 6 months ago. And now I'm doing 60 pounds. When I really think about that, that's kind of a big deal, And so little stuff like that where it's like, I am getting better and you can focus on that getting better part. I think that's massive. And then, it's like I said, it's tough for me because I always had that. I was able to look at other people and just like realize like this is what it is for what it is, but not have it negatively affect me. I think that's eventually you got to learn to be able to do that a little bit as well too. But yeah, like early on, just realize like you just, you run your race, you focus on your own thing and keep the focus on that. And and then just whatever you're doing that's enjoying, like that's the whole thing with like social media and all that kind of stuff too. It should be simple advice, but like if something's not bringing you enjoyment or joy, like don't do it. I mean, it's like I remember talking about people like, I love a lot of social media and obviously it's huge for my profession, but like the parts that when there was literally things if I was either looking at or watching or whatever, and I was like, why am I looking at this? Then I'd stop looking. I even joked with my wife, like at some point in time, she's like, I don't like social media. And I was like, then you should stop doing it. And she's like, I think I will. And she literally just like stopped doing social media, like period. And she's like, this is better, so you don't have to do social media to work out either. They don't go hand in hand. It's not a requirement. So little stuff like that as well too.
Popular belief.
Yeah. So it's, even if you don't post it, it still happened. I promise. So no, I just thought adding that on top of Matt's advice, I think is all great advice, but yeah, just, stay focused on progress and it adds up and that's awesome. Like who doesn't ever want, like that's the whole point with anything in life, if you're getting better and building upon things. And that's the cool thing about bodybuilding. It's one of the few things you can, not few things, but yeah, it's one of the few things you can like literally look down and be like, I did this. I mean, that's obviously at what point in time you can actually look and say, I was 140 pounds and I'm 160 pounds. Like I said, looking at your logbook, that's an awesome thing. And if you can just hang on to that, I mean, that, in my opinion, that doesn't get old. So
yeah.
That's it. That's all the questions I had. Do you guys want to add anything else?
No.
I'm good. Joe's like, no.
We did it all. I think we covered it all.
All right, so that's it. Episode 43.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you guys, and we'll be back.